Hello and welcome to the race data analysis for the Italian Grand Prix of 2021. This is the series in which we compile all of the race data, which is mainly the lap times, and look at the whole race as a whole. Doesn't really make too much sense. And then pit each of the two teammates together. Everything is all timestamped in the description down below, so feel free to skip to whichever bit of the video you would like me to talk about. So without further ado, let us jump on into the race data for the Italian Grand Prix, and we'll briefly take a look at the overall positions table for this race. And as we can see, it's probably one of the most boring positional tables of this entire season. Most of the positional changes happened in that pit stop phase between laps 22 and 28. There were only 22 pit stops this entire Grand Prix. We can see, however, Valtteri Bottas charging through the field from P16 at the end of lap number 1 all the way to P4 at the checkered flag, but P3 after Sergio Perez's penalty. And genuinely, other than that, there is literally no other positional changes whatsoever. So instead, we can take a look at the actual lap time chart set, and we can see that there is a nice consistent band up until the safety car for the Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen collision at lap 25, until the safety car came in on lap 31. We can then see a huge, enormous peak at lap 44 for the VSC, which was for Nikita Mazepin's car, I think, when he retired near the end of the Grand Prix. But just zooming in on the overall lap time set and excluding all of the pit stops and stuff, we can see it looks a little bit like this. Nowhere near as definitive bands as we saw at the Dutch Grand Prix, but we can actually see 4 different bands of racing in the opening stint of the race. We can see the first group of cars, which consist of Max Verstappen, the 2 McLarens, etc. Then there is a middle group, there's then a second middle group, and then unfortunately there are the 2 Haas cars, which are the light green and the light blue all the way at the top, where we can see at lap 18 to lap 20, they are 2 seconds slower than anybody else on the track. Then after the safety car, pretty much everybody is within 2 seconds of each other. There isn't any great deal of spread after the first safety car. And then after the VSC for Nikita Mazepin's retirement, there are then 3 bands of racing once again. But what we can do from this lap time chart is we can isolate all of the drivers' clean air laps and average them out into a table that looks a little bit like this. Now, in order to determine what a clean air lap was, any lap that was set outside of 3 seconds of the car in front, mainly due to the enormous tow factor at Monza. So any lap time that is set outside of 3 seconds of the car in front will be included into this average. There is then a huge truncation period that goes from that selection. Normally, after isolating those clean air laps, we reduce the total number of laps by about 25%. From that reduced section of laps, I then remove the slowest 30% and the fastest 2, so we have a nice middle range of the clean air laps overall, and that is what gets averaged into this table here. So we then end up with the overall average lap time set, which had Daniel Ricciardo as the fastest driver in clean air by almost 4/10 to Valtteri Bottas, and then 6/10 back to his teammate Lando Norris, which is shown just here in the gap column. And as we can see from Nikita Mazepin downwards, there are a lot of erroneous values, with people that only have a certain number of clean air laps which weren't competitive at all. This gap is then converted into a percentage gap, which means we can then compare it to all of the other races across this season. And then we can take a look as well at the number of clean air laps. And by far and away, the most of any driver was Daniel Ricciardo, leading the race from start to finish. 36 clean air laps compared to Valtteri Bottas's 3 after charging through the field. We then have this and a percentage of the total race laps, and then we have the standard deviation of their clean air lap running pace. Now for the drivers Nikita Mazepin downwards, I have not included them in this season's average so far, where we take that middle percentage column, the percentage gap column, and average it across all of the races that have happened so far this season, and we end up with this table that looks something like this. So Max Verstappen is still the fastest driver across this season so far, with Lewis Hamilton still 0.09%, exactly the same as it was last round. And then doing exactly the same for the team overall, we end up with this order here. So Mercedes are still just 0.05% slower than Red Bull. They are slowly closing that pace gap overall. We have seen it at around 0.3%, 0.4%, and it is now just 0.05, with Ferrari still the third fastest car overall, but McLaren having retaken them for third in the Constructors' Championship. And then just a small visualization of where these clean air laps start overall. We can see it looks a little bit like this. The majority actually of the clean air laps came in the first 50% of the race, where there was an enormous pace differential between each of the groups, where everyone was able to sort of spread out. And then after the safety car, it was only really Daniel Ricciardo who had a lot of clean air laps, and also the two Haas cars who were massively slower and ended up falling off the back of the train of cars. But in order to make the clean air lap analysis just that little bit fairer, as obviously lap time set in the second half of the race will be much quicker than lap time set in the first half of the race, we can take a look at the overall stints and the stint pace. So we can take a look at stint number 1 for the clean air lap running. We have the medium tyres on the left and we have the hard tyres on the right. Once again, there are a few erroneous bits of data, so Nikita Mazepin and Esteban Ocon on the mediums, and then especially Lewis Hamilton on the hards as well, as he was stuck behind Lando Norris. But once again, we have the two McLarens that were definitely the fastest cars on the medium tyres in stint number 1, with Ferrari actually being incredibly close to them as well. With the Mercedes of Valtteri Bottas actually having the quickest race pace in stint number 1 on those hard compounds of tyres compared to Daniel Ricciardo, who was on the mediums. Then from stint number 1, we can take a look at stint number 2. Now, there are a couple of drivers with a bracketed asterisk by their name. These are drivers that did set lap times on these tyres. However, they did not set any clean air laps on these tyres. And we can see that for the hards, it was actually the Ferrari to take its turn at the top of the leaderboard, but only just. With interestingly George Russell in the Williams being 3 milliseconds behind Daniel Ricciardo, the race winner. So that Williams in the second stint on the hards had almost race-winning potential speed. But now that the clean air lap analysis and the race overview is all done and dusted, we're going to break down each of the teammates overall. And we are starting in 2020 championship order, so we start with Mercedes and we'll end at Williams. Like I said, everything is timestamped in the description down below, so please feel free to skip to whichever team you would like me to talk about. I will be explaining each of the graphs in the Mercedes section, so if you would like that little explanation, then please stick around for just a moment's time. So on screen right now is the Mercedes panel overall. We will start in the top left with their lap time chart. Lewis Hamilton is in the black line and Valtteri Bottas is in the turquoise line. The grey dotted line is the fastest Mercedes car of the previous Italian Grand Prix in 2020. And we can see that it's roughly 2 seconds a lap faster than their 2021 pace. With the graph directly below that being the Mercedes gaps, this is the gap between the two cars on every single lap of the Grand Prix. Then in the top right, we can see the positions chart as well, and we can see Valtteri Bottas's climb through that leaderboard. And then in the bottom right, we have the percentage pace difference. So this percentage pace difference takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times and will divide them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times. Obviously, Hamilton ended up retiring halfway through this race, so we only end up taking the first 25 laps of Valtteri Bottas's tally. These divisions are then converted into percentages, and then any percentage that is over 100 is when Lewis Hamilton is going faster, then any percentage below 100 is when Valtteri Bottas is going faster. These are then ordered from largest down to smallest, and then we end up with this nice little distribution that we see on screen. And we can split this percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 44% exactly of the race, it was Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise who was going faster, and therefore for 56% exactly, it was Lewis Hamilton. Now, interestingly, even though Valtteri Bottas was charging through the field and battling with the slower cars, if we take a look at stint number 1, the gap was staying at just below 20 seconds. Yes, it was increasing just a little bit, but from 15 seconds at the start to 20 by lap 10, that is nowhere near as a significant impact as I would have expected. Which either just goes to show that Valtteri Bottas was charging through the field extremely quickly, or how much time Lewis Hamilton was losing behind the McLaren of Lando Norris. Then by this red line here, we can see the retirement of Lewis Hamilton and then also the safety car period between laps 25 and laps 31, which is the end of the gaps chart overall. So if we now take a look at Mercedes lap times and compare them to their 2020 pace, we can see that in 2020 they set a 1 minute 24.4 in clean air overall, compared to Bottas's clean air lap across the entire race of a 126.441, a difference of just over 2 seconds. But unfortunately, Lewis Hamilton didn't set any competitive clean air laps across this entire race, having been stuck behind Lando Norris in all of stint number 1, but we can see Valtteri Bottas's pace in stint 1, and then unfortunately he didn't set any clean air laps in stint 2, as he was stuck behind Sergio Perez for the entire time. And unfortunately, this trend of not setting enough clean air laps is very common, and especially common in this Italian Grand Prix. Sometimes we end up with nice comparisons that we can make, but for this Italian Grand Prix, there isn't that many that we can make at all. So from Mercedes, we'll now take a look at Red Bull, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle. For 36% of the race exactly, it was Sergio Perez in the darker blue line who was the faster Red Bull, and then for 64% of the race, it was Max Verstappen. And similarly to the Mercedes lap times, both drivers were setting extremely similar times. The gap stayed between 8 and 12 seconds, all the way up to Max Verstappen's retirement with Lewis Hamilton. But arguably this is more to be expected because Sergio Perez isn't stuck in a great deal of traffic compared to Valtteri Bottas, so perhaps there could have been a little bit more of a difference or a little bit less of a difference. And then in exactly the same way as the Mercedes panel, we can see the retirement of Max Verstappen and then that safety car period that we saw in the middle of the race. And so looking at Red Bull's times and comparing them to 2020, they didn't actually set a competitive lap time in 2020, mainly because both cars ended up retiring. But Sergio Perez set a 126.730, and then stint number 1, where both drivers were on the mediums, we can actually compare the two, and there was a 7/10 difference between both drivers. With interestingly Sergio Perez being the faster car, even though he was a couple of places behind Max Verstappen, who was stuck behind Daniel Ricciardo. Then stint number 2, there weren't any clean air laps that we could compare for either driver. So from Red Bull, we'll now take a look at McLaren overall, and we can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 49.1% of the race, it was Daniel Ricciardo in the blue who was the faster McLaren, and then for 50.9% of the race, it was Lando Norris. Now this is as even as you could possibly be, whereas if it was a 54 lap race, it would have been a dead 50-50 split. And we can see how close these two drivers were together by just taking a look at the lap time chart. It's literally identical. There is no real difference, apart from a couple of slow laps in a row from Lando Norris that were about 8/10 slower than Daniel Ricciardo. I'm not entirely sure what that was. It could have been a small battle with Lewis Hamilton. I can't quite remember what happened for those 3 or 4 consecutive laps where he was 8/10 of a lap slower. But then we can see the confusion with the pit stops and the safety car period, where Daniel Ricciardo actually came in a couple of laps beforehand, before the safety car came out, and then Lando Norris came in, which allowed Ricciardo to get back past. Then post-safety car, they were just extremely even once again, exchanging being the faster McLaren runner. And then, of course, we have the VSC period, which just ever so slightly spiked the gap in Daniel Ricciardo's favour from about 1 second to 2 seconds. So Ricciardo actually gained a second through the VSC period, which shouldn't really be allowed. The gap should stay consistent, but it never really does. And taking a look at the McLaren lap times overall, compared to 2020, they only lost 1.2 seconds between their 2020 pace and 2021. However, there was quite a significant difference between Ricciardo and Norris in clean air over the whole race, just 6/10 overall, whereas stint number 1 on the mediums, Ricciardo was almost 2/10 faster than Lando Norris. Whereas most of this difference ended up coming in stint number 2, where Lando Norris didn't set any clean air laps, as he was always within 3 seconds of Daniel Ricciardo, whereas Ricciardo was able to pump in lap times to bring his average down. Then from McLaren, we'll take a look at Aston Martin, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 62.3% of the race, it was Lance Stroll in the pink, who was the faster of the two cars, and then for 37.7%, it was Sebastian Vettel in the green. Now again, much like Holland, this was a little bit of a disappointing race for Aston Martin. The car just didn't really seem to have much potential, and if we can take a look at the lap times overall, we can see that Stroll is actually fairly consistent. He did have a sort of odd bow shape as he started off quick, slowed down by about half a second, and then sped back up until the safety car period. But we can see that Sebastian Vettel was extremely inconsistent in his lap times. Yes, this was the point where he was battling with Esteban Ocon and a couple other drivers, so it could be that. However, it's just a little bit interesting to compare the consistencies of the two drivers. Then of course we can see the confusion with the pit stops, which spikes the gap in Stroll's favour to over 35 seconds. Then post safety car, unlike the McLarens, there is a significant 2 to 3/10 gap consistently where Lance Stroll is the faster car, which raises the gap from about 3 seconds to 10 seconds over the course of 15 or 16 laps. We then have the VSC period, which actually benefits Sebastian Vettel as he significantly decreases that gap from 10 seconds at the start of the VSC to around 8 seconds at the end of the VSC. So he actually gained 2 seconds under the virtual safety car, which just shouldn't happen at all. But comparing the Aston Martin's lap times to 2020, they lost 2.5 seconds, almost 2.5 seconds, and that is one of the most significant time losses of this year. And that is a trend that we have seen pretty much all season long, along with Mercedes as well. However, it has affected Aston Martin so much more. Mainly the low rake cars have been ripped down all of their rungs that they had in 2020 compared to the lower rake cars, which haven't lost anywhere near as much lap time from last year. And unfortunately, losing 2.5 seconds whilst your rivals are only losing 1.5 seconds, so there is that second deficit between the two, pushes you from the top of the midfield from last year to the bottom of the midfield this year. Whereas Mercedes, where they have lost 2.5 seconds or 2 seconds from 2020 to 2021, whereas their rivals Red Bull have only lost a second or so, that second deficit only puts them behind, which is why Mercedes are now pretty much level, if not just a little bit behind Red Bull, whereas Aston Martin have just collapsed down the midfield because the midfield is so tight. And unfortunately for Sebastian Vettel, there are no clean air laps that he set throughout this entire race, so we can look at stint number 1 and stint number 2, but there are no comparisons that we can make. So we will now take a look at Alpine, and we can split the percentage pace difference down the middle, and therefore for 30.2% of the race it was Esteban Ocon in the white, who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 69.8% it was Alonso in the blue. And much like the Aston Martins, we can see that there was enormous consistency from Fernando Alonso compared to Esteban Ocon in the white, who, like I said, was actually battling with Sebastian Vettel for a little portion until he got his little 5-second penalty for nudging him off the track. Then we can see the safety car confusion where Ocon briefly gets past Fernando Alonso, but then the positions sort themselves back out after the pit stops under the safety car. And we can see post-safety car that they are pretty much identical. There is literally no difference. The gap stays at 2 seconds. But once again, we can see that the VSC does have a small little impact. Ocon actually loses a second to Fernando Alonso under the VSC. However, he immediately gains that back as Alonso has a couple of slow laps. But looking at the overall Alpine's lap times, we can see that compared to 2020, they have lost just that little bit more than Aston Martin by just 20 milliseconds. Which is why both Alpine and Aston Martin didn't have very good races in Italy. And unfortunately for Esteban Ocon, he didn't set any clean air laps in this race, so that for stint number 1, there are no comparisons to make, and neither are there for stint number 2. So from Alpine, we'll now take a look at Ferrari, and we can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 32.1%, it was Carlos Sainz in the black who was the faster of the two Ferraris, and therefore for 67.9%, it was Charles Leclerc. And interestingly, in the opening portion of the race, even though the two Ferraris started very close to each other, there is a almost 1 second per lap gulf between the two drivers, which is extremely extremely significant. I'm not 100% sure what happened to Carlos Sainz on lap 10. I don't know if he was involved in any incidents. Obviously there was that one with Giovinazzi at the very start of the race, but that caused a small little VSC period. But I'm not sure what happened on lap number 10, why his lap time was so slow. But then, of course, we can see the confusion with that safety car, which spiked the gap in Leclerc's favour to 18 seconds. And then post-safety car, they were literally identical, exactly the same as we saw with the Alpines. But then post-VSC, where the VSC didn't really have that much of an impact on the Ferraris, there is once again a 1 second per lap difference between the two drivers. So once again, even though they both had a decent race and decent results, not really compared to McLaren, but decent results for Ferrari as a team, there is a really big gulf between Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, exactly like we saw in Holland. But taking a look at the Ferrari's lap times and comparing it to 2020, we can't, as they didn't set any clean air laps in 2020 as both drivers retired. However, there was a 0.2 difference in clean air between Leclerc and Sainz. However, this difference was 0.4 on stint number 1, and then in stint number 2, Leclerc was unable to set any clean air lap times. So from Ferrari, we will now take a look at AlphaTauri, where there is literally nothing that we can take a look at. Yuki Tsunoda didn't even start the race, and Gasly retired on lap number 3. So from AlphaTauri, we will now take a look at Alfa Romeo, and we can split the percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 71.7% of the race, it was Giovinazzi in the white who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 28.3%, it was Robert Kubica. Now, although these icons do say Kimi Raikkonen, it does mean Robert Kubica. I just can't be bothered to change it from Raikkonen to Kubica in order to change it back to Raikkonen again next race. But if we move our attention to the lap time chart overall, we can see consistently that there was about an 0.8 to 1 second per lap gap between the two drivers. However, with Antonio Giovinazzi being involved in that first lap incident, he was actually behind. So we can see that this gap decreased from 40 seconds at lap number 1 all the way down to 23 seconds at lap number 24, which is an extremely significant pace gain. Then, of course, we had the safety car brought out, which rose the gap in Kubica's favour to just over 50 seconds. However, of course, the safety car was going to reduce that, and it did all the way to pretty much nothing. Then after the safety car, they were running pretty much identical lap times, so Giovinazzi was not able to maintain that pace difference that he had in the opening portion of the race. Then, of course, we had the VSC period, and then we had a small little mistake from Robert Kubica, which allowed Giovinazzi to get back past. But whether that was a sort of team order switch or a mistake from Kubica, I'm not 100% sure. But either way, that mistake on lap 48 from Kubica allowed Antonio Giovinazzi to get back past. And taking a look at Alfa Romeo's lap times overall, they lost 1.5 seconds to 2020, with there being a 0.6 gap between the two drivers, Giovinazzi and Kubica. With stint number 1, this gap was actually 7.5, compared to stint number 2 on the mediums, where Kubica was able to close that gap down, or Giovinazzi was not able to exploit the most out of the tyres. The gap was down to 0.3. Then penultimately, we will take a look at Haas, and we can split this percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 41.5% of the race it was Nikita Mazepin in the white who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 58.5% of the laps raced together it was Mick Schumacher. And we can see that in the opening portion of this race, they were literally identical. There was absolutely nothing to separate the two Haas cars. Up until the safety car period, where again, there's that little bit of pit stop confusion, exactly like we had with the Alpines. However, Mick Schumacher ended up maintaining his position over Mazepin. Now, post-safety car is where the differences really started to pop up. Mick Schumacher was able to put in a consistent 87-second lap times for around 15 or so laps. However, Nikita Mazepin was not able to do this, which led up to their ultimate collision. And then obviously the subsequent Nikita Mazepin retirement with his engine issue. Now, it is possible that this engine issue did start a couple of laps beforehand, which was the reason for his slowness. I'm not 100% sure, but as we can see at the lap times, in that first stint, they were pretty much even. And then all of the differences happened after the safety car. So the engine problem could have been that factor. Who knows? But taking a look at the Haas lap times overall, they lost 2.2 seconds from 2020, with Nikita Mazepin not actually setting any clean air lap times, as he was always within 3 seconds of Schumacher in that opening stint. So stint number 1, we can't compare anything, and then stint number 2, Mazepin ended up retiring, so we can't compare anything. And then finally, we will take a look at Williams, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 50.9% of the race it was Nicholas Latifi in the blue who was the faster of the two Williams, and therefore for 49.1% it was George Russell. Now this is actually a trend that we have seen a lot with the Williams. Although in qualifying, George Russell massively outperforms Latifi, in the race it is so much closer. Latifi genuinely has a lot of decent race pace, but yet he still gets hounded, unlike George Russell. And we can take a look at the lap times overall, and we can see that they are literally consistent. Yes, there is a couple of places between the two drivers where Latifi is actually ahead of George Russell, but their lap times are consistent. The gap stays between 4 and 6 seconds up until the safety car, where we see that the safety car does end up massively benefiting George Russell, as he is able to get past Nicholas Latifi under this safety car issue, as Latifi pitted just a couple of laps before the safety car came out, so he ended up losing that 20 or so seconds that you gain from a pit stop under the safety car compared to a pit stop not under the safety car. So unlike Daniel Ricciardo, who pitted on lap 22 plenty of laps before the safety car, Latifi was caught out by this issue, and that is what led to the swap in positions. And then we can see that post-safety car, once again, they are setting literally identical lap times. George Russell is perhaps 2, maybe 3 tenths a lap faster than Latifi, so he raises the gap from 2 seconds to 4 seconds, but that is over the span of 12 laps. Then we have the VSC period, which actually does benefit Nicholas Latifi, which decreases the gap from 4 seconds to 2 seconds. And then by the time we end at the checkered flag, they are setting exactly the same lap times. So if it wasn't for missing out under that safety car, Nicholas Latifi would have been the Williams that scored points and not George Russell. So George Russell benefited significantly under the safety car compared to Nicholas Latifi. But comparing the Williams lap times to 2020, they were 1.7 seconds slower than 2020's pace, which actually is one of the lesser gains of this entire field for the Italian Grand Prix. And we can see that over the whole race in clean air, Latifi was the quicker car, only by 14 milliseconds, but he was the quicker car. On the hards, however, it was George Russell, but again, only by 70 milliseconds. And then for stint number 2, the gap was just 48 milliseconds in Russell's favour overall. And there we go, there is the end of the race data analysis for the Italian Grand Prix. If there is anything that you would like to let me know of, please let me know in the comments down below. What was your most interesting thing that you found about this data from the Italian Grand Prix? But that is all I got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.